So, welcome to the second day of our series on. So, oh, sorry. Okay, we'll have to just start over. Sorry, the recording paused itself. I'm like, that won't work out. All right, so now we can welcome everybody to our second day on trauma and resiliency in tribal communities. And again, we are really happy to be partnering and have the National Native Children's Trauma Center with us. I know on Tuesday, many of you got to meet Amy, and today you will get to meet Veronica, who will be your facilitator for today's session. As usual, before we get started, we will kick off with our quick disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Veronica for day 2.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let me know if you guys can see that.
Looks
all
good.
Right. Thank you. I'll just begin by introducing myself. Yat she Veronica Willero D. Cranianishia, Huan Tlanishlena Kademna Bashichin, Torigini Dashanala Tranasani Dashache. Tsech each bit twoden asha do Billings, Montana da Keshte. Kutego dena san shle. Hello, good morning or afternoon for some of you, maybe. My name is Veronica Willero D. Crane. I am of the Minihogans clan and born of the Mexican clan. My maternal grandparents are of the Tango clan and my paternal grandparents are of the Bitterwater clan. I am from Ojo Encino, New Mexico, from the Navajo Nation. Today I'm joining you from Billings, Montana, the original lands of the Abzalika people, where I work and live. I am Dene, enrolled in the Navajo Nation. My husband is Abzalika, enrolled in the Crow Nation, and we have 5 children. My professional background is in Indian education. I've worked in Montana Indian education for over 10 years and still do as a school coach for the Montana Office of Public Instruction. I started out with doing a school turnaround grant and supporting schools with student, parent, and community engagements. And I've also worked in after-school programs, youth leadership, providing student behavioral supports and academic support. I came to the NNCTC almost 3 years ago. At the NNCTC, I'm a training and technical assistance manager. I lead a project in which we partner with the Tribal Youth Resource Center to provide trauma-informed care training and TA to tribal youth programs and juvenile healing to wellness courts. In addition to this, I get to provide support to schools in trauma-informed care. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you, and I invite you, if you would like to introduce yourselves and chat. It's always nice to see where everyone is coming from and what role or organization you're representing and what brings you to this training today. So I invite you to go ahead and do that. Tuesday, day 1 of this training, you are with Amy and you covered trauma terms and concepts. You talked about the breakthrough ACE study that led to trauma being such a big topic in healthcare and human service circles. And you identified connections between traumatic stress and child development. Today, we will be covering the concept of historical trauma and how it might relate to present day traumas and other conditions experienced by tribal people, and describe the protective factors that build resilience and other possibilities for recovery. So just to give you guys a reminder, I know Amy covered this in day one, but trauma can be a painful topic. So some of us in this room will probably recognize ourselves or our loved ones or community members in the subjects that we're going to be discussing. You might be reminded of experiences that are very upsetting. You might find yourself having unpleasant emotional or physical responses to some of the information or some of the discussions. So I just encourage you to seek help if you have feelings of disturbance that continue beyond the training today, or if you have feelings that interfere with your ability to go about your daily life and engage in meaningful relationships. So just encourage you to reach out, talk to a friend, talk to a professional, local resource there in where you're at. So to get us started, right off the bat, I'm going to give us a chance to go into some breakout rooms. And on day one, you guys got a chance to meet Damien and to learn about Damien's story. And so this is a continuation of that. And today we're going to be reading Sherry's story. So that story is being shared with you in the chat box. So you're welcome to pull that up on your screen, and you'll be going into your breakout room. And I'm going to ask you to think about these 3 questions. What traumas do you see in Sherry's story? So far we've talked about individual, community, and system level traumas, different types of traumas. And so what do you see in Sherry's story? And then what behaviors or challenges in Sherry's life may be linked to those traumas? So in her story, you may recognize some behaviors of hers and some challenges that she's experiencing. And so just think about how they may be linked to those traumas. And then the last one, just continuing from the last story of Damien, what does Sherry's story reveal about Damien's traumas that may be linked to his behaviors at school? So just think about those 3 questions and go ahead and we'll launch the breakout rooms. I'll give you guys 10 minutes. And if you could please, for the sake of time, I'm also going to ask you all to designate a spokesperson from your group. So when we come back, I'm going to be asking as many of you of your spokespersons as we can get to share a summary of what you guys discussed in your breakout room. So everyone has a chance to hear from what others have discussed in other rooms that they weren't a part of. So go ahead and go into your breakout room and read about Sherry.
And just a quick reminder to everybody, over in the chat box is Sherry's scenario. So if you click on that, it'll download so that you can open it up once you're in your room. And that's right over in the chat box. And then away we go to breakouts. And if you're having any difficulty joining your room, you're welcome to ask for help in the chat box or unmute, and we can help get you in your room.
Hi there. We cannot get the story.
Okay, what room are you in?
Room 1.
All right, let me see if I can hop into room 1 and maybe if I put it specifically in your box, it'll let you have it.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Let's see.
Sorry, I don't see the chat in the chat box. I didn't see the story.
The story over in the chat box.
Yeah,
It's the last document there. It says Shari's scenario.
okay, I probably went into the thing before looking at it.
That's okay.
Hold on, let me,
Do you see it over in the chat box right now?
I see blank, but I'm on my phone right now. I'm gonna have to, let me try a different way. Hold on.
Yeah, and it's sometimes a little difficult to get the handouts on the phone. Veronica, if you don't mind, I'll send you to group 1 to try to help them. And I'm going to try to get the other ones squared away.
Were you able to go in and do that for us? Because we still don't see anything.
Oh, let me see. It moved her. I think, so Veronica should be in your room right now trying to fix it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then let's see. Ashley, Courtney, Barbara, and Laura, are y'all having trouble joining your rooms? Let's see.
Okay, those guys got it. Did
Perfect.
everybody else grab theirs?
So far, everybody else I think is now set.
Okay.
And then let me see.
So Amy put the questions in the chat box.
Mhm.
They should all be able to see that, correct? Okay,
Yeah, they should be able to see everything that was in the chat box prior to them leaving.
okay.
Ashley and Laura, are y'all having any difficulty getting into your room? Oh, Laura, never mind. I see you're on the phone. All right, I think everybody may be squared away. I don't have any more help messages. And most everybody's in their room. So.
It's cool to see some Montana folks, Amy. Tammy Elser
Yeah,
Yeah,
and Carolyn Roosh.
folks from all over.
and there's a message in there about Navajo Prep School.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, Shauna. She used to
Yeah.
be my Navajo history and government teacher
Nice.
at Navajo Prep.
Yeah, they have quite a few grants actually.
I just put all of those 3 questions together again and put it more up front.
Yeah, and I will say, once they're in their rooms, what you post right now, they
Oh.
can't see.
Oh, okay.
Only what was in there before they left the room. That's the only difficulty, is once they go in their room, they can only see their own internal chat boxes. They can see everything before, but only their
Mhm.
current group's messages. And then once they come back, it picks back up with everybody. A little bit of a weird system.
I think we can broadcast it, right? I'm gonna
Yeah.
try to do that.
Can you copy and paste it from the chat?
Should be able to. Usually there's like a little 3 dots out beside it. And if you hit it, it'll copy it.
Oh. Easier than when I tried.
Teresa, are you having any trouble joining your breakout room? All right. We should have about 2.5 more minutes.
Thank you for keeping track of the time.
I tried to remember to look when I hit it.
I know, I was like
I'm
trying
not
to find the time on my screen. Digging for it.
Yeah. When you get so, at least personally, I get so into what I'm doing, and then I'm like, oh, I was supposed to be keeping time.
Yeah.
Oh, even Ashley got into a room now. All right. It's a
Right.
banner day.
Hopefully the second breakout will go smoother for them. Now that we know.
Well, and honestly, typically the ones who stay in the room, it's not because they don't know how to join the breakout room. It's because they've stepped away from their computer, or like Laura, she took a phone call, something like that, where they haven't joined. Most of these folks, I mean, we're on with Zoom with them almost every week. They know how to join. It's just my polite way of saying, go join your room.
This is all being recorded, right?
Yes, but I edit the recording as well. So everything while they're in the breakout room, we cut out because nobody wants to watch us just
Yeah.
like, wait for them to come back.
Right.
Yeah, so I usually put in a slide that's like back from discussion group.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And
Oh, you
sometimes
can
if
do
we're
that.
just doing a couple, if we're doing actually like facilitated breakouts, I can have the facilitators actually record the breakout rooms and we can plug those in. But when you have a ton of breakout rooms and when they aren't facilitated, it's too hard to try to get them to record.
Yeah.
Yeah, breakout rooms are difficult too, because what I found when you first get into one, you want to just talk about who, get to know each other. And
Yeah.
that can take a while, and then move to the topic. And by the time you move to the topic, it's over.
Yeah, that is always a difficulty because even though we're on with the group in general a lot, it's typically they spend more time in their grantee groups. So they know a lot of the people maybe who have their exact same type of grant. But then because they only do maybe 1 to 2 events a month, that's like everybody, they don't know those folks as well. So yeah, it gets into the, oh, who are you?
Where are you from?
Yeah. All right, I'm going to give them their 1 minute warning. Oh, and Veronica, it's showing the version that has your notes right now.
Is that better?
That's the one.
Okay, good. Okay.
If you're coming back in the main room, everybody else has about 25 more seconds before they'll be back with you. They're taking those last few moments in their breakout. All right. Well, the breakouts are officially closed and everybody should be back in the main room. Welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for participating in that short discussion. I hope you got a chance to read over Sherry's story, practicing our reading skills. So I'm curious which group would like to go first. And I'm going to give us about 3 to 4 minutes to share out. So just a summary of what your group discussed. It doesn't have to be all of the questions that I asked, but whichever you wanted, your group was able to address. Is there a group that wants to go first? Okay, we have
Okay,
someone
hand up.
who raised their hand.
Number 8.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah, we just kind of went through the profile for Sherry, and it just appears that she lives in a really unstable situation right now. She's got a new husband with stepchildren. She's got a toddler, 10-month-old, and they're all living with her father. And so that's unstable, and there's I'm sure a lot of stress with with Sherry dealing, caring for her toddler as well as trying to keep track of her stepdaughter and son. And it appears that her life growing up in her own home life was unstable. Her mother had left at one point, and when her father kicked her out of the house when she was a senior in high school. It appears that she had hoped to go to college, and those dreams sort of evaporated and didn't get to go. Her grandmother was trying to encourage her, but it didn't happen. And her grandmother was in declining health, which added another level of stress, I'm sure. It appears that she went, was drinking and using drugs. She was kind of herded into a special ed class, I guess, when she was in school with other Native kids, and they didn't get a lot of the right kind of instruction or care. And so she was kind of just grouped together. She's afraid that Damien would experience the same thing. When she's frustrated and mad, she sort of blames all her stress and bad experiences kind of on her son, and actually says that he would end up like his no good father, or out of control behavior. So it appears that our group kind of briefly chatted about it, and it seems that she's transferring a lot of her trauma from her youth in home, and the instability and stress that they're experiencing right now, and transferring that all onto Damien. And of course, I'm sure that's making it difficult for Damien to keep to focus in on what he's doing in school. So and it's probably leading to some of the out of control behavior that's mentioned here.
Could I ask a question to maybe the entire group because I didn't see it and I had the narrative read, but I wasn't sure. Did the woman move back to the reservation with a non-native husband? Is that part of the story, or did I just insert that with my imagination?
I don't, it didn't say anything about whether the father was native or not, only that he was her new husband and that they were living with Sherry's father. And I assume that's on the reservation because they mentioned that she was sending her son Damien to a school off the reservation. So I assume they're living on the res.
And he's not from her community, the new husband?
Doesn't say.
Okay, just trying to paint a full picture because there was all these gaps in my mind.
Yeah, it didn't really say much about the father. Only that in the bottom it mentions that the Damien was a victim of some kind of abuse, but it doesn't say whether it was her current husband or other past relationships that she had. Probably a past boyfriend.
Right. Well, thank you so much, John, for summarizing that for us. I feel like it was helpful, especially for those of you who didn't get to spend a lot of time discussing it, or well, that was a really good summary of the story. I think particularly I'm hoping that we can identify some of the individual traumas, community level traumas that we think Sherry experienced. And I think you mentioned some of them, but if we could just clarify what those were for Sherry. It sounded like maybe some feelings of rejection from her father, having been kicked out of the house, maybe some neglect that she experienced while living with her parents, and then of course the loss of a loved one with the death of her mother. So that's just to mention a few, but does anybody else want to add to that quickly before we move on?
I can add, our group 6 was great at identifying it. We saw some, just some socioeconomic trauma that was leading to it, sexual trauma and abuse. And then also just the intergenerational layers of it as well.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning the intergenerational layers and the community system level, because that socioeconomic, right? We can look at it as an individual experience, but it may be a similar experience to others in her community, to other families as well, besides just herself, if she was growing up on the reservation and that was the experience for that reservation.
Yeah. One thing I missed is that it appears that her mother abandoned her and living with her father, and it was her grandmother who was in poor health who had passed. So those definitely, that feeling of abandonment, I'm sure, from her mother, and then her, I'm sure, depending on her grandmother, whether grandmother passed, but that was another feeling of being left, to her own devices.
Absolutely.
And there's a couple of comments too in the chat.
It appears that she was also abused by family friends too.
So sorry, Amy, I think your audio cut out.
Oh, so can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, there's just a couple of comments in the chat too. One is
Awesome.
I think this is a really good example of how complex these issues are and how hard it is for some children, in this case 2 generations, to tell their own story. Thank you for that. And group 3 saw this as historical and complex trauma, and also stated that we see this type of trauma with the children in the schools we serve. Thank you.
Yes, it is very complicated, right? There's layers. There's also cumulative trauma, just one traumatic event after another that a person experiences, that Sherry experienced. So thank you for adding those in the chat. So I'll go ahead and move us forward for the sake of time. Thank you so much, you guys. I appreciate you guys being engaged in that, in this activity and learning a little bit more about Damien's experience, as well as kind of hearing a little bit more about his background by learning more about his mother's story. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to talking about common responses and experiences. I know that Amy covered this on day one, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes it can be, it can be difficult because in our communities, we may see different behaviors and different challenges, like we're mentioning, it was mentioned, similar to Sherry, we may know of people in our communities and in the communities that we work with, the tribal communities that we work with, that have different experiences similar to Sherry's. And so Amy mentioned some of those common responses to trauma and how some of the behaviors that get exhibited or displayed by individuals in our communities, that they can be linked to and related to trauma experiences, and they can actually be trauma responses. And so a good way to think about trauma responses is in these different categories. And there is another handout that is on the immediate and delayed reactions to trauma. That's the title of the document. And so it'll be put in chat for you and you can pull it up and look through it. But it really describes the different types of trauma responses that are most common, that experts in the field have identified, even though everybody's individual trauma reactions are different. These are just some common ones, and it describes some of the ones that can happen immediately after a person experiences a traumatic event, as well as some reactions that people can have to trauma that can occur later on, and sometimes even years after they experience a traumatic event or events. So for emotional responses, these can be the changes and feelings that individuals have as a result of that trauma. For physical responses, these are the changes in their physical health and in their brain development, as well as in the experiences that they're having with their bodies. So their bodily physical reactions. And then there's the cognitive responses. These are changes in how we think and process information and understand our surroundings. And then there's the behavioral responses. This is the changes in how we act, including changes in our habits and activity levels, whether we're more active or less active in interactions with other people, and as well as how we interact with our environment. And then there's the spiritual, or others might think of them more as existential responses. And this is just changes that an individual has in their beliefs as a result of the trauma that they've been through. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up that document real quick, just to give us a look at what some of these reactions are, and these common reactions, to put it in our minds. And because I'm going to ask you guys to think about your own community and the community that you're working with, the tribal community that you're working with. And can you guys see this? It looks kind of small on my end. Just want to make sure you guys can see it. Okay, zooming in. Can you guys see the document?
Yes, we can.
Awesome,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on the left side are listed some immediate reactions, and then on the right are some delayed ones. So just for example, let's look at the emotional reactions. So immediately after a traumatic event, a person might be going through denial. They might be exhibiting some anger, feeling helpless, feeling overwhelmed, just having a lot of guilt. If they were a survivor of some type of trauma and others were not. And then some of the delayed examples are feeling shame later on, maybe developing depression, maybe struggling with anxiety. So just different types of emotions that a person can experience right after an event as well as later on. So just go ahead and look through this document and just kind of take a look at some of these different reactions. Amy mentioned some of them on day one. She mentioned some of the ones that maybe are common for those that we know of, that people with post-traumatic stress disorder might be struggling with. So some of those common responses or reactions to trauma. One of the things that, sometimes if we're in a mental health field, we see some of these things as like, people struggling with their mental health. If we're in the health field, we see them as, people struggling with, sickness or illness. We may see just maybe we think that there's some issues that people are having with their thinking and the way that they think and their thought patterns. So these might come up for us. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to asking you all, as you guys are kind of looking through that document and we've seen some of those examples and how they can be categorized in these different ways, and that can be helpful for us to kind of pinpoint some of those responses that we may see people in our community exhibiting. So these are actually, those signs and symptoms, because sometimes we don't really know a person's full story. So these are just the signs and symptoms that something may be happening, something may have happened to them. And so think about your own community, and I invite you to go ahead and go to this website. It's www.menti.com. And when you get to that website, there's going to be a place where you can enter in this code 64636015. And so go ahead and go to that website, enter in that code. And I'm just going to ask you to share anonymously, what trauma responses do you see in your community? As you're thinking about those ones from the handout, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up that Menti meter presentation. All right. Folks are seeing substance abuse as one of the trauma responses, anxiety. They're seeing children who are struggling, who fail to thrive. Are there others that are seeing some trauma responses in your community? Folks engaging in risky behaviors? Absolutely. Depression, hopelessness, with being withdrawn, lack of motivation, increased in need for mental health supports. general sadness and sense of hopelessness about their situation. Absolutely. Avoidant behavior, just not wanting to deal with it, address it, talk about it. Distrust, fatigue and confusion, chronic unemployment, absolutely. Suicide or suicidal ideations, absolutely. Low self-esteem and academic rates, kids not able to control their emotions and working out their frustrations physically, absolutely. Sometimes people stay angry forever, yes. Poor eating, yes. And phone addiction, child custody disputes, discrimination, drug abuse, mental issues, and community engagement issues, withdrawing from cultural activities, which leads to further trauma, absolutely. Someone said that they see all of these behaviors in the schools on reservations, low self-esteem, all the others, high dropout rates, intimate partner abuse. Yes, people feeling trapped by the economy so they can't leave that relationship, that abuse. Absolutely, gaslighting, elder abuse. Yes. So thank you guys so much for sharing. I really appreciate you being willing to share about your own community. Try to make it a safe way to do that by making it anonymous. But you know, these are real issues that our communities face, and it can be challenging to talk about it and to really name these different trauma responses. But I'm sure each of us are thinking about maybe even individuals or just you know, different things that we know are going on in these communities of ours. And you know, it can be challenging to do that. So thank you for participating in that and being willing to share. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up my screen again. Can you guys see what I'm sharing?
Right now it's sharing it along with the slide sorter along the side. Oh,
Is
now,
that better?
now
Okay.
it's back.
So I'm gonna go ahead and move us along, and thank you guys for just thinking about those trauma responses that we're seeing in our communities. You know, we talked about Sherry, and now I'm gonna talk about a type of trauma that many of us are probably familiar with. Maybe we've been to a training on this before, maybe we've talked about it just with our colleagues or just with our friends, our family. Maybe, you know, it's a conversation that's happening in our communities already. But this is historical trauma, which is a type of trauma in our tribal communities. And it can be discussed as a political, psychological, research, and tribal community concept. For example, historical trauma is political because of the treaties and past policy eras initiated by the United States government to eradicate our nation's cultures and traditions. For example, boarding schools, which interfered and changed kinship and family relationships, as well as the mass killing of American bison, which impacted hunting and gathering lifestyles. Historical trauma is also a psychological type of trauma due to the psychological response to these political agendas carried out by our government. Historical trauma has also been theorized and scientifically examined through research in American Indians. So there has been research done in American Indian populations. And finally, it is important to remember that American Indians are heterogeneous and each tribal community has their own historical trauma experience. So even though we collectively share some experiences, how it actually impacted each of our communities and tribal nations may be different. So this should be important for us to keep in mind as we try to work with tribal communities and conduct trauma-informed services. So with any conversation about trauma in our tribal communities, it's very difficult to ignore the mass violence and oppression that North American Indigenous people have experienced over centuries. We can't understand the impacts of individual traumas in the lives of Indigenous people, such as the ones we mentioned earlier, child abuse, violent incidents, or the sudden loss of a loved one. We can't understand these individual traumas without understanding the ongoing impacts of historical trauma on tribes and communities. Historical trauma is often ignored in discussions of trauma outside of tribal communities, but as tribal people who directly experience this kind of trauma, we understand how historical trauma is the soil in which other traumas take root. We, as Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, have experienced tremendous losses over the course of more than 400 years. We have been through genocide, where entire tribes were wiped out, especially on the East Coast. We have been forced to relocate, like the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk. And the introduction of diseases crippled our populations and was purposely used against us as an act of war. We have been through forced assimilation, including Indian boarding school policies that removed children from their homes and subjected them to abuse. We have also suffered losses due to policies and that prohibited tribal, spiritual, and cultural practices. And we go through persistent racism and stereotyping that continues to this day. The Lakota psychologist Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart pioneered the study of historical trauma among North American tribes. She looked at the Jewish Holocaust and how subsequent generations of those who were in those internment camps continue to suffer impacts, even though they were not there themselves. Yellowhorse Braveheart saw similarities with what tribes have been through. She approaches this history of our tribes from a psychological framework, pointing to the lasting intergenerational effects that have resulted. She defines historical trauma as the cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. Here, she identifies historical trauma as a cumulative and collective trauma. Historical trauma for North American tribes was not just a singular era or event. Without recovering from one historical event, these tribes experienced another and another. So entire communities and nations were affected, not just a few. There's another Native researcher who has taken the definition of historical trauma a little bit further and says it's a complex trauma experienced by a collective group of people that share a group identity or affiliation. It's the legacy of numerous traumatic events a community experiences over a generation and encompasses both psychological as well as social responses to these events. For example, the removal of children from their homes and being placed in these schools, or the removal of children to be raised not in their tribal communities, but by non-tribal members in predominantly white communities. So not only is historical trauma a cumulative and collective trauma, it is also a complex one that impacts individuals developmentally, and this complexity makes it difficult to treat. And another aspect of historical trauma is that it is a generational trauma. So as I have mentioned, as we talked about Sherry's story, somebody mentioned, intergenerational trauma that was passed down from one generation to another. So It's not just the generation that directly experienced a historical event that is impacted, but it's also their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all of the generations after. Sometimes historical trauma is used interchangeably with intergenerational trauma. According to experts in the field, the difference is that historical trauma is linked to ethnocidal and genocidal intent, whereas intergenerational trauma, not all of intergenerational trauma is necessarily due to ethnocidal or genocidal intent. A common misconception about historical trauma is that it refers to events that happened a long time ago before any of us were born. But it's important to point out that this idea is wrong. Researcher Les Whitbeck has noted historical trauma is not historical in the sense that the events that caused it have concluded and are no longer having any influence on our contemporary life. We know that there was never a day that the US government declared its war on tribal peoples was over. We know that Native Americans continue to be subjected to forms of discrimination that no other groups are dealing with, such as, the issue with blood quantum for enrollment. We could all list numerous examples of how these traumas persist. So the degree to which historical trauma affects individual people on a psychological and spiritual level is often debated. Many tribal people feel that focusing too much on historical trauma is harmful and pathologizing, while other tribal peoples may experience vivid reminders of the losses of their tribes and suffer consistently today, just thinking about those losses, and they feel the reality of those losses on their daily lives. It's also difficult to study historical trauma to verify one way or another the degree to which it continues to impact individuals. One of the reasons is that it is very difficult to separate the effects of historical trauma from other types of trauma, since historical trauma is the root of so many present-day difficulties that tribal peoples face today. What does seem pretty clear is that there is a direct connection between historical events and current conditions of tribal communities. The establishment of the reservation system, the breaking of treaties, the many attempts of forced assimilation, much of this trauma occurred before those of us in this room, Zoom room, were born. And so we naturally think of those events as history. Even the abuses and disruption of families and tribal customs that resulted from the boarding schools, we probably think of it as a historical event, even though it continued into the 1950s. And there probably is folks on this call today who are present today who have experienced it or whose parents or grandparents experienced it. But in addition to the damage those past events caused to the people who are living at the time, those same events directly caused and or continue to influence many present day realities, such as those listed on the right side of the screen. So the poor economic conditions on the reservations that we know about, the persistent discrimination that tribal peoples still face today, health disparities. We know the statistics around health for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Underfunding of service systems in Indian country. We know that Indian health services, education systems, schools have been underfunded. And just the disparities in child protection and juvenile justice systems, the overrepresentation of Native children in those systems. So in addition to these conditions that are caused by historical trauma, it's also important that we talk about historical trauma as a wound that was suffered by our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, who, along with the personal struggles caused by those wounds, passed down those wounds to their children and to the next generation. So hopefully you guys can see the chart on the screen, but in order to better understand historical trauma, a researcher, Whitbeck and his team, they developed this historical loss scale. They conducted 3 focus groups with elders from 2 reservations in the upper Midwest. The goal of these focus groups was to understand their perceived losses of historical trauma. So how frequently these elders thought about losses shows us how prevalent and immediate these historical loss thoughts are. For example, of these elders, of these 55 years and older, only 10% of the people asked didn't think about losing their culture, but 30% of them thought about it daily, and they thought about the loss created by alcoholism for their people as a result of those losses. So historical events and circumstances have a current impact on American Indian populations. That's what this study is revealing to us. And the grief and loss that these events created are still active thoughts for many people. So they may be active thoughts for you, for your family members, for people in your community, and the people that you're working with in your professional roles. Whitbeck also and his team also put together this historical loss associated symptom scale to go along with the other scale. It's to identify how often there were emotional responses, including anxiety, depression, or anger and avoidance when people thought about historical losses and had reminders of those losses versus, if those emotional responses were related to their current traumas. So he had 143 respondents, and they were adult parents and caregivers of children aged 10 to 12. So Whitbeck and his team found that there is a connection between emotions and the current thoughts of past traumas, so that there is a strong connection. When people think about historical losses, they have an emotional trauma response to them. For example, out of the people who were asked, only 15% reported they don't feel anger when thinking about these historical losses. And 26% of the people reported sometimes losing their ability to concentrate as a result of thinking about these losses. So how severe these symptoms associated with historical thoughts of historical losses is unknown, meaning we don't really know how these symptoms associated with thoughts of historical losses impacts functioning. We don't know how it impacts their parenting. We don't know how it impacts their behaviors. But we do know that it's having an emotional impact from this study. So what was believed to be the most detrimental to Indian people by researchers and tribes was the assimilation policies around removal, particularly the idea of removing generations of children from their tribal families, from their homes and their communities, and placing them in boarding schools. So we all know what's happening right now with the identification of graves at the boarding schools in Canada and here in the United States. I'm sure we've all heard about that. So children who were experiencing adverse traumas in these schools were as young as 3 years old. Some of them never returned to their families, as we know, as we are hearing about these grave sites. If they did return and didn't die from disease or accidents, it wasn't until they were 17 or 18 years old. The boarding school experience was particularly harsh for many of them. It was an environment where the children often did not receive an adequate education. They were forced into labor for the local community where that school was located. They often didn't have adequate food. They were separated from their siblings, which was very different from what they were used to, because they were used to sleeping and eating and playing together with their siblings. But in boarding school, 12-year-old girls were on one floor, 5-year-old girls were on another floor. Boys and girls were separated, sisters and brothers were separated, and you didn't know where your siblings were or what was even happening to them. There were also the harsh treatment by boarding school staff. Children experienced neglect, physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse at the hands of their caretakers. And they often return to their communities with the belief that the language and spiritual beliefs of their tribe were inferior and something to be dismissed or not participate in. So I mentioned that there are both psychological and social impacts as a result of historical trauma. You can see that reflected in Yellow Horse Braveheart study that identified both psychological and social consequences of adverse boarding school experiences. And some of those consequences are listed on the screen. Social consequences like poor school relations, psychological consequences like having a weak ethnic identity and having a weak spiritual foundation. Similar to how we discussed emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual trauma responses, the immediate and the delayed ones, that individuals can have to individual traumas as well as to community and system level traumas. There's also trauma responses for historical trauma. In Yellow Horse Braveheart study, historical trauma responses among natives and its relationships with substance abuse, she calls historical trauma responses the constellation of features in reaction to historical trauma. She talks about substance abuse as one of those historical trauma responses and how it's a vehicle for attempting to numb the pain associated with trauma. Other historical trauma responses that she identified are listed here. And some of you mentioned seeing them in your community.
Veronica, before we move forward, just want to attend to a couple of comments.
Sure.
That came up. One was about how COVID is also quite a trauma for everyone right now, and that there's quite a few comments from our colleague here, Bernie, talking about inadequate mental health systems and communities, limited psychological counseling, as well as limited for traditional tribal languages to promote resiliency through culture. Trauma is not supported in Medicare, Medicaid. Challenging to help colonial minds and institutions to understand historical trauma and how it's getting reinforced, from Teresa. Taking away buffalo, salmon, longhouse style of living, replaced with hut houses, boarding schools taught abusive parenting. School enforces rules like boarding school by using the good Indians to enforce rules that ignore culture and identity. Isolation holds wounds. Too many girls had babies from priests and others. And then that this is feeling heavy, judging up a lot of emotion, and that we might need a prayer for healing. And it would be a good idea to acknowledge and unpack as a group.
Absolutely.
Smudging.
Is there anybody from the group that would like to offer a prayer for us?
And one other did say it's definitely going to be hard to work the rest of the day.
Absolutely. We understand that talking about all of this, especially in detail as I have, does bring up reactions and emotions, our own responses to that trauma, particularly as we are Indigenous people and this is our experience. We are part of this experience of historical trauma. So I completely understand. I do want to go with someone's suggestion of offering a prayer. So if there is someone that would like to do that right now, who would be willing to lead us in a prayer? So I do want to give people, someone the opportunity, just someone older than me. But if you guys are okay with it, I will go ahead and offer a prayer for us. Just out of respect for my elders that are on this call, I want to give that opportunity for them to share a prayer. But I'm happy to go ahead and do that for us right now. So I just ask everyone just to, if you're comfortable with closing your eyes, and just taking a deep breath. Creator God, I come to you right now before you, just a humble person, just someone that, you know, doesn't have a lot to offer you, and just recognizes how much I need you and how much we need you. And I just ask you to come near to all of us that are in this call who are talking about and hearing about all of this devastation, all of this hurt, all of these wounds that we have been through as a people and that our communities have been through and that maybe we have personally been struggling with. I ask that you just come near us, that we feel your comfort, that you protect our thoughts, protect our bodies, that you help us to release all this pain and all these wounds, and that we not carry it for the rest of the day. I ask that you would just protect our hearts, just guide us in how we talk about this and how we address this, and to also bring to our minds, to the forefront of our minds, that healing is possible. Healing is possible. And not only is it possible, but it is likely. And so more often than not, we are resilient people, and you have made us that way. You have helped us to become strong. You have given us the skills and the resources. You have made us who we are, that we can draw upon that and we can recover. So I just thank you for that. And I just help you to put that at the forefront of our minds and let it calm us and let it comfort us as we move forward with this training, and just be with each person, whatever their individual struggles are with this content. And whatever is blocking them from continuing to move forward with this training, I ask that you would just put that aside for them and help them to feel safe and calm right now. I pray, amen. So thank you so much for that recommendation that folks gave, or someone gave. I know it's very difficult to talk about these things, and I purposely didn't give opportunity for folks to talk about their own community's historical traumas, because I know it can be triggering. So we do have a scenario, a story on Reggie, and that's what I'm hoping, that we can spend some time talking about Reggie. We don't have to talk about our own communities and the historical traumas, events, traumatic events in our own communities, but maybe by reading Reggie's story, we can unpack this a little bit more, and maybe talk about it a little bit more without having to personalize it in a way that may be harmful for us or difficult for us to talk about. So right now, I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to go into breakout session again, and to just read Reggie's story. It's going to be in the chat box, and you'll have again 10 minutes to read his story and just to talk about some of the historical traumas that maybe Reggie has experienced, and how it may be impacting his life. And then maybe talk about, after knowing more about Reggie's story and about the way that historical trauma has impacted him, maybe how we can think a little bit more about how it's also impacted his daughter and his grandson. So if you are okay with it, I invite you to go into a breakout room. But if you are not okay, if you are not feeling up to it, you do not have to. This is a time where we also encourage you to take care of yourself. So instead, if you want to take a break and step away for a little bit, you're welcome to do that. Take a drink of water or stretch. You're welcome to do that instead. So we'll go ahead and go into the breakout rooms.
And just a little reminder that Reggie's scenario is over in that chat box if you want to download it before you join your room.
Yes, feel free to step away for a break if you need to. Or if you're up for it and you want to continue to process this information, feel free to join a breakout room and read about Reggie.
Thank you for the prayer, Veronica. Very powerful. Great.
So thanks for interrupting me and telling me about the chat box, because it like disappears on my
Yeah, right. It's hard to see that.
desktop. So I can't see it. And then on top of that, the people's faces disappeared.
Mhm.
So I couldn't see anything.
Yeah. And I think most people have their cameras off.
Yeah, I usually just see you and Sarah's faces.
And I know this is the pivot where we move to resilience. And I was about to say that before we went into rooms.
Mhm.
But that'll be good. Good way to go next.
Yep.
I'll be back in a few minutes.
Did you have the timing?
Yes, so they should have about 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Wanted 10 minutes again, right?
Mhm, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna give them their 1 minute warning.
Awesome, thank you.
If you're starting to pop back in the main room, the other folks should be back with you in about 10 seconds.
Okay.
All right, the breakout rooms are closed and everyone's back.
Awesome. Welcome back, everyone. So thank you so much for those of you who were up for joining a discussion and taking the time to do that. So I do want to say that I hope it was easier to talk about it just through Reggie's story. If there is a group that would like to share a summary, who has a spokesperson that would like to share maybe some main points that you covered in your discussion. Maybe a group that hasn't shared yet, who wants to take a healthy risk and share with the whole group.
I can't remember which room I was in, but we just talked about how the very last sentence he talks about if he was able to figure out his own problems and get his life together, that his daughter should be able to do it too. We talked about that not everyone handles the same things the same way, and that even though he kind of got his life together, because he still ended up abandoning his daughter, so I wouldn't say he fully got his life together, but even though he kind of did and he got off the drugs and whatever, he probably would have had an easier time if he'd had somebody supporting him. So maybe that's something that he could have thought about with his daughter, is if he's abandoning her, how it's going to be a ton harder for her to get past it, even if she can.
Absolutely. So he's comparing his own trauma to his daughter's and believing that she can respond in a way, in a way that would be more resilient, maybe, as he has done. Absolutely.
There's a comment in the chat. Olani's group decided to put their thoughts in the chat. They saw repeated generational trauma. They discussed about when does this trauma stop? Abandonment, again, is a critical trauma. Also, Sherry is being punished for something she was never taught or saw how to do.
Yes.
For sharing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's one that hopefully we can address. As Amy was talking about, while some of you were in your groups, that we're going to be moving into talking about resilience and healing. So the whole point of when does generational trauma stop is a good point. And so hopefully we can address that a little bit more. And absolutely, it seems like you guys are showing some sympathy for Sherry and trying to understand from her point of view some of the things that she's been through that may have affected her. It looks like someone else also mentioned that healing didn't occur for both dad and daughter. Yes, that's a good point. Is there anybody else, any other group that wants to share?
There's a couple more in the chat if you can see that.
Now, Teresa, it does take courage and other things to just move forward with healing. Carolyn mentioned about boarding schools, which was Reggie's experience, that he wasn't taught what he needed to be taught. And so had a lack of empathy and low self-esteem and didn't know how to be parents themselves and lost our old ways, absolutely. So things that maybe he would have learned had he stayed with his family in his community that he would have learned, he didn't get a chance to. Yeah, no one knew him when he returned to the reservation. That must have been pretty traumatic for him. Healing feelings and pain are usually seen as a weakness and denied and avoided. Absolutely. Wow, you guys are really bringing a lot from this story, and I really appreciate that. Just diving into Reggie's story. I know it's a difficult topic and it's difficult to unpack, but hopefully after reading Damien's and Sherry's and now Reggie's, we kind of understand how, some of the decisions or behaviors or actions that people take in their lives can be linked to trauma. So I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. With this next slide, it's just basically a summary. I'm sure some of you have seen it before in other contexts. Typically, the bottom 2 layers of generational embodiment and social conditions. There's another version where those are not in the visual, but for this slide, they are there to help us see how historical trauma or generational traumas, how they can be the root of some of the social conditions that we see in our communities, some of the things, community level and system level things, experiences that our communities and individuals in our communities go through. And so how some of those conditions are set up to cause people in their childhood to experience adversity and to experience trauma. And we've learned through this whole training from day one how ACEs can have an impact on a person's development. It can cause impairment, brain impairment, neuro impairment. It can cause social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which can put people at risk of adopting health risk behaviors, as we've seen in Sherry and Reggie's stories, which can increase their risk of having problems with disease and disability and other types of social problems, like dropping out of school and being unemployed. And then that can put people at greater risk of an earlier death, as we know how some of these social problems and these diseases can lead to a shorter lifespan. So what I hope that you will not take away from this visual is that a person who experiences historical trauma or even adverse childhood experiences, that they're destined to have an early death. As we've talked about, people respond to trauma differently. And an important aspect for us to understand and to remember as we're talking about trauma is that it's more likely that people will be resilient and that they will be able to heal from, and they will be able to recover from the traumas that they experience. And so what we're really talking about in today's training are those people or those individuals that maybe are struggling to do that. And so they may be not able to recover in the way that they would like, or we would, we all would like. And so that's what we're focusing on. So we don't want to paint the picture that every person that experiences trauma is gonna have these outcomes. There is a greater risk for them, but we also know that it's more likely that they can recover and that recovery is possible, and not just possible, but probable. So I'd like to just invite us to take a deep breath again, because, and release some of that trauma that maybe we've been holding our breath in, taking shorter breaths because we're talking about this difficult topic. So just take a deep breath and just release that tension that maybe your body is feeling right now after talking about this difficult subject, and just remembering to keep at the forefront of our minds that recovery from trauma is probable. So we've learned about all these different types of traumas and how they impact people. And now we want to move forward and talk about what do we do with that information now that we know about trauma and we know how it impacts people? What should we do with this knowledge? So one of the things that we can do is when we look at people's behaviors and we look at what's happening in our communities, we look at the students that we work with, the individuals, our colleagues that we work with, and maybe we kind of recognize some signs and symptoms of trauma. We can start to ask ourselves what the function of those behaviors are, of those responses are. So we can understand, we can process within ourselves when we're seeing these behaviors and experiencing them from other people, that the reason for them is a trauma response, is basically that survival instinct. It's that instinct to keep themselves safe. It's that adaptation, even if it's maladaptive, they're trying to cope with what is happening with them. And so they're trying to stay safe, even if there's no real danger to them. Maybe they're trying to avoid being hurt by someone again. Maybe they're just trying to find a way to calm themselves down or to reduce their fear and anxiety. So hopefully knowing this, that it can help to move us towards understanding and recognizing these behaviors and reactions as coping. And maybe if we're able to manage our own trauma responses or our own reactions, the way that we respond to others who are displaying or exhibiting these behaviors will be different, because we can understand and we acknowledge and we empathize with what's happening right now in the moment as they're being triggered by, a trauma reminder, as well as empathize that maybe there's more to their story, that maybe there's things that we don't know that they've been through that they're trying to deal with. And so hopefully it changes the conversation that we have about some of the behaviors and some of the conditions that we see in our community. And then I hope it brings to our minds this idea of resilience. So resilience, if we boil it down, it really means a positive adaptive response in the face of significant adversity. So there's often negative, adaptive response, there's maladaptive response, but there's also times when people actually respond positively. They adapt positively to traumatic experiences, to adversity. So what is the nature of this response? What does that positive adaptation actually look like? Where does it come from? So resilience is not a fixed characteristic that you either have or you don't have. Neither is there some fixed amount of resilience that a person has access to, and then it's used up. Instead, resilience results from the interaction of genes, the environment, experiences, and physiological responses. So while some people might have more of a genetic disposition to resilience than others, resilience can be developed in people and promoted. So children are especially capable of resilience because their brains and their physiology are still developing, but adults can develop greater resilience as well. If we think back to our scenarios, we see that both Reggie and Sherry indulged in some unhelpful thinking, or maybe they made statements about their family members' capacity for resilience. For example, Reggie kicked Sherry out of the house, justifying his action with the idea that self-reliance might do her some good. And then in a different example, probably equally as unhelpful, is Sherry sometimes lashes out at Damien and attributes his problem behaviors to his character or his genes, calling him no good. So what is it about these moments in the scenarios that is unhelpful? We have all heard people praising other people for pulling themselves up by their bootstraps or toughening it out or having enough grit to get past their struggles. So these are cliches that while they might have their place at times in certain conversations, in certain relationships, are more often toxic in the context of trauma and resilience. So we would never expect a person with a severe trauma history just to decide one day to be positive or to be able to stay positive, and encouraging someone in this way is likely going to make them feel worse about themselves than they already do, and promote hopelessness if they feel like they can't just, get it together. So instead, positive responses to adversity tend to happen because of a mix of resources that people have in their lives and the ways that these resources interact with their inherited traits and experiences. The resources that can foster positive responses to adversity typically involve other people, relationships, and community. All these sources of strength that go beyond just the individual making that choice. And there's no standard recipe. There's no magic pill for resilience. Everyone is different. They have different genes, they have different life experiences, different personalities, and different trauma triggers. And they have different responses and perspectives to different situations. So as a result of decades of research in various disciplines, we do know that a common group of factors make young people more likely to be resilient. So you might have heard of this as protective factors. So protective factors, they don't eliminate the effects of trauma, but they can balance those effects out. They can soften them and provide stability, even in the face of severe trauma, severe stress. So when several protective factors are all in place, children and young people can thrive in spite of exposure to very serious traumatic events. Even adults who may have been struggling with significant trauma and struggling with trauma symptoms and behaviors for years, they can build resilience and change the path that they're on. So as we look at our communities and toward our individuals who might be struggling, we want to think about how to promote protective factors in their lives or factors that help them develop resilience. So the first protective factor I'll be bringing attention to is one that has the largest and most reliable evidence base. So researchers have found over and over that the single most important protective factor for children who experience adversity and stress is having at least one solid and trusting relationship with a supportive adult. So it doesn't really matter so much who this supportive adult is, if it's a parent or a coach or a friend, a teacher. So who the person or people are doesn't matter as much as the characteristics of the relationship. So it has to be a solid and stable one. It has to be an unconditional one. And the child has to trust the person. So what this kind of relationship does is insulate the child who's experiencing adversity from the worst effects of that adversity. Though the child may still deal with the perceived threats, the stress that results may not become so toxic that it disrupts their brain development or causes physiological wear and tear. So the trusting relationship balances out the lack of trust that may come from others and some of their more troubling relationships. It provides structure, a place where the child can go to get personal attention, and the type of attention that allows them to build positive adaptive skills and habits rather than the maladaptive ones. So there are other protective factors identified by researchers, but resilience is actually fundamentally rooted in relationships. Children who are able to manage their traumatic stress effectively do so largely through and with the help of meaningful relationships with adults. So often children who experience severe trauma can have trouble with trust, with opening up to others, with making themselves vulnerable in these relationships. So these habits are the result of other failed relationships that they've had, other relationships that cause them harm. So that's why they may have a hard time trusting people. But healing after trauma can begin to occur when we see that there are, in fact, people who we can trust unconditionally, and that there are people who do make promises to us and keep them, and people who do keep us from danger. So it can be a new experience for a child. So relationships, I'm talking about all these researchers saying it's the best protective factor, but our tribal communities it's not a new thing for our tribal communities. Our communities are often more tightly knit than other communities, and tribal members living in their home communities often have large extended families. Even in tribal towns, everybody knows everybody. So what this means is that most tribal kids and young adults potentially have a large support network. So lots of different people who might be able to be that one supportive adult for them. Another common protective factor among those who thrive after adversity is connection to a life-affirming religious, spiritual, or cultural tradition. So this can be, more organized religions like Christianity, but it could also be a tribal traditional spirituality that a child can connect with. So there is at least one study that has found that cultural continuity, a sense of being connected with your tribe's past and responsible for the tribe's future survival, is among the strongest of all possible protective factors against suicide. So this is really important for our tribal communities, and it's something that is unique to our tribal community. It's that sometimes other kids don't have, non-tribal kids don't have. So another protective factor common among people who have responded positively to adversity is that they have a sense of mastery over their own lives. So children who believe they can overcome difficulties and shape their own destinies are much better positioned to ward off toxic stress and develop adaptive skills than are children who feel that their lives are completely shaped and determined by others or by their situations. So as adults, we too can heal, and it's possible for us to build our own mastery and to build our own sense of control over our lives. So not just children. So not everyone naturally feels a sense of mastery, especially with a child who has a difficult home life or a child who has experienced lots of losses. They may have very good reasons for not feeling like they have a sense of agency. Maybe they've moved from home to home. Maybe they have unpredictable caregivers. But there is still room for all of us to have choices, even when even if our circumstances limit those choices. So this is one of the key things we can help with as adults who come in contact with children, or with adults who have lost a sense of self-mastery ourselves. We can support people in the belief that they have control over their lives. We can help them see that they have choices. We can create opportunities for them to build skills that will help them feel more mastery, and we can support them in making good choices for themselves. A fourth protective factor common among people who respond positively to adversity is the development of strong executive functioning and self-regulation skills. When we use these terms, we are referring to the mental abilities to plan, stay focused, follow instructions, and balance the demands of multiple tasks at the same time. So people with strong executive function and self-regulation skills can prioritize tasks. They can set goals and control their impulses. They're able to filter out distractions and accomplish assignments. So no one is born with these skills, but everyone is born with the ability to develop them. They are ideally developed early on in relationships with caregivers and other adults. When children are supported by adults who make them feel safe, they are able to practice and hone these skills through play and social interaction. So adults promote the development of these skills when they provide young people with regular routines, when they model appropriate social behavior, and when they engage in supportive, trusting relationships with them. So these are just 4 broad protective factors that we've covered. So they're not the only protective factors, but we mentioned them in this training because they're the ones that have the most convincing evidence of effectiveness in young people. And they're broad enough that at a community level, no matter what role you play in that community, that there's lots of things that you can do to try and promote them. So sometimes we may feel helpless, like what do we do? How do we address trauma? We may look at our communities, and as we're seeing what's going on in them, it may be difficult for us to come up with ideas, but there's just some examples of things that we can do depending on our role in the community. So we could help agencies, help schools develop missions that incorporate protective factors. We could support the design of programming for young people that promotes these protective factors. And of course, we all may come into contact with young people, our own family members, our own children, and we can intentionally and purposely keep these protective factors in mind and provide them opportunities to access them just by being personally in their lives. So the U.S. Attorney General's Advisory Committee on American Indian and Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence was assembled in 2014. And what they did is they had these listening sessions in tribal communities, and they made recommendations based on what they heard. And what they found out is that 75% of deaths of American Indian and Alaska Native youth ages 12 to 20 are actually as a result of violence. So what they recommended is that it's most appropriate that we assume that all tribal children have experienced trauma. And this can be difficult, for some of us. We may know tribal children who are resilient, have enough resiliency that they're, they've recovered from trauma. We may have differences of experiences that we know of in our tribal communities, but the reason for this assumption is really more of a strategic one. It's really to ensure that there's a mobilization of appropriate levels of awareness and government actions that are needed to change policy and effectively address trauma-related problems in Indian country. So that's one reason why, to be able to get the resources to these communities, that need them, to prioritize those resources. If people just understood the prevalence of trauma that Native youth are experiencing. So that's one way, policy-wise, a way to address trauma. But of course, there's also different trauma treatments that are out there. Each tribe has their own traditional healing practices that youth can be connected to, that individuals can be connected to, but there's also the Western-based ones. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a version for adults, and there's a version for children. There's even a version that can be delivered to children in schools. So that's cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in the school, CBITS. It's a group intervention that can be delivered in schools for older children, and then Bounce Back is the version for younger children. But in addition to this, there's another handout that I wanted to share, and it's called Practice. The title of the handout is called Practice, and it's basically the acronym for these components of cognitive behavioral therapy that you see on the screen. And if you'll go through the handout, you'll kind of notice that there are some things that we as people that maybe are not mental health professionals, things that we can do to support those who are struggling with trauma, struggling from the effects of trauma. So we might not be able to have these intensive therapy sessions that happens with cognitive behavioral therapy, but as you read the descriptions of these different components, you can actually see how those of us maybe are educators, maybe we are people that work in the community that interact with youth. There's things that we can do to support those individuals who are dealing with trauma. So it breaks it down. There's things that we can do around psychoeducation. There's things we can teach young people that are some relaxation skills and affect modulation skills and cognitive processing skills. There's just the ability for us to be open and to be willing to listen if a young person wants to share something about their experience with us. So we might not, know every detail of their trauma history, but they may want to disclose or want to share something with us about related to their trauma experience. So there's different things that we can do to enhance safety. So just take a look at that handout. There's a space where you can actually write down some thoughts of things that you feel like you can personally do to support individuals who are dealing with trauma. So lastly, before we end, I want to go ahead and invite you. We talked a lot about protective factors. We talked about resilience. We talked about trauma treatments. We talked about things we can do, around the mission of organizations, around policy of organizations. We talked about just different ways that we can do to support young people, to help them become more resilient, as well as to help them heal from the traumas that they've been through. So I invite you to go to, once again, to www.menti.com and enter in that code, the same code, and just, share. Maybe there's one thing that you can think of that you can personally do, or what you feel like, in your community can be done to address trauma. So I welcome you to share that. And I'll go ahead and pull up that screen so you can see everybody's responses.
Just a note, Veronica, that the Mentimeter question is the same question as the first one. So we'll just have to ignore that. It says, what trauma responses do you see in your community?
Yeah, so let me pull up the actual one first. I think it won't show
Okay.
up until I go to that screen. So Let me exit out of that last question. Okay. It should be showing up for you now. Yes, somebody put be cognizant.
Oh, good, yeah.
So sorry for this comment. That's from the last question. But someone else put listen. Absolutely. Stopping to listen to a young person. That can go a long way. Show empathy, be an agent of change, create a positive and negative environment with youth and adults. I think you meant create a positive environment, be available, increase the number of healthy relationship opportunities and mentors. Absolutely. Be patient, find help. Absolutely. Validate, educate others. Exactly. There may be things you're already doing, right? Some of these things that we've talked about, maybe it brought up some ideas of examples of things that you already do, or your community already does, your agency already does. Continue to listen and provide a safe space for our youth. Yep. Keep the conversations going and be patient. Yes. Patience. Yes. Have the hard conversations, acknowledge painful feelings, be supportive by listening and advocating for children and their families, give food or drink before talking, absolutely, taking care of those physical needs, be empathetic and develop a relationship to establish trust, communication on platform that they choose, absolutely, being open to all responses without judgment, yes, talking circles, yes. Wow, you guys are killing it. Yes, these are great examples. Thank you so much for sharing them. It just gives us an idea of just the possibilities of what we can do, because sometimes it may feel like, what can we really do, right? What are some things that we can actually do to address trauma? So as you continue your education, so hopefully that will, you will feel more of a sense of, yes, there's things that I can do, and you will have some ideas for that. So just to end, this is our contact information, and there's an evaluation on the screen for you to complete. If you want to reach out to us, as Amy said, we'll be sharing the PowerPoint. We'll be sharing again the handouts and the references for all of the research that was mentioned. But I do want to close with this poem. It's by a Native poet named Tanea Winder, and I'm sure some of you already know who she is, but I thought it would be a good way to close because this was a very heavy topic. We tried to balance it with talking about resilience and protective factors and healing and what we can do, but I acknowledge that it can still be a heavy experience to go through this training. So I want to make sure that we end on a good note. And one way that we can do that is just this poem. It just recognizes all of the strengths and the beauty that are within our tribal peoples, within our tribal communities. And I hope that you will take it with you and walk away from this training, not just here knowing about the trauma, but also knowing about the healing and the resilience and the beauty of our people, the strengths of our people. So wake up, greet the sun, and pray. Burn cedar, sweetgrass, sage, sacred herbs to honor the lives we've been given, for we have been gifted these ways since the beginning of time. Remember, when you step into the arena of your life, think about those who stand beside you, next to you, and with you. Your ancestors are always in your corner, along with your people. When we enter this world, we are born hungry. Our spirits long for us to live out our traditions that have been passed down for generations. Prayer, ceremony, dance, language are ways of being. Never forget You were put on this earth for a reason. Honor your ancestors. Be a good relative. Thank you so much for joining us for this training. You guys have a great rest of your day.